Welcome to the Citizen Mike Show. Thanks for tuning in. We do appreciate it. My name is Mike Berdinsky. Somewhere on that split screen, we hope, is Riley O'Connell, the Democratic candidate for the Mayor of Wallingford. Riley, thanks for coming on the Citizen Mike Show. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike. I appreciate it too.
Yeah, we got a lot of ground to cover, and we may miss. I don't know. I hope we get into all the topics, but I wanted to share with our viewers some of the ground rules that you and I have kind of talked about. I think we sort of arranged this back in August, not knowing what the issues were going to be. We kind of picked the target date, and whatever happens in the future happens. And also, as is my practice, I try to give you a heads up as to the topics that we're going to cover, so that you can sort of focus your energies on those topics. The questions, even I don't know what they're going to be. We don't know how a conversation goes. But we did have that little preparation, so that you could prepare, and just so the viewers know, that those of you who are looking for a gotcha ambush kind of a show, this ain't it. I like to have the guests at their best, and if they have a great answer, that's terrific. That's how we want that. If an answer is a little weak, well, they had their chance to prepare. At least that's the theory. It doesn't always work, but at least that's the theory. Riley, I want to give a little brief bio that I took from your website. As I recall, you're a fifth generation Wallingfordonian or Wallingfordite. Family's been around for a long time. You went to Pond Hill School, DAG Hammarskjöld School. You graduated from Choate in 2014, graduated from Bowdoin College in Maine in 2018. And then you went to work for the Department of Justice from 2018 till the earlier part of this year, when you started your mayoral campaign, and you were employed there as a paralegal. And you've been on the campaign trail a long time. Let's talk money for a minute. You've raised some dough, have you?
We have. Campaigns cost money, so from day one, that's been an important focus. I apologize, I didn't get the chance to check my treasurer to get the exact amount, but just shy of 30,000 is about where we are right now.
I want to get something out here in the very beginning. I don't know if your viewers can see that, but this is something I picked up. It's one of your pieces of campaign literature. Well done, a professional piece of literature. Now, if upon watching the Citizen Mike Show, thousands and thousands and thousands of viewers want to flock to your assistance and donate thousands and thousands of dollars, and to volunteer and have lawn signs and meet and greets and all the other campaign activities that you do, how would they get in touch with you?
The easiest way is probably just go on the website, which is O'Connell2021.com. That's OCONNELL 2021.com. And there's plenty of ways to contact us on there. You can volunteer, you can donate. We always need as much help, and we want as many people as part of our team as possible. Unfortunately, the outpour of support kind of caught us by surprise in some regards, and the fact that within just a couple of days, we ran out of our 300 lawn signs. So we just put in an order for some more. So there might be a slight delay on that, but everything else, we always appreciate whenever we hear from you.
That sounds good. So let's get down to business and some substantive issues. There were some recent developments this week. The most recent was the town council meeting on September 14. That dog pound issue came up again for the Citizen Mike Show. It's the gift that keeps on giving. It's an issue that never dies. But we're not going to get into that in depth because it's been covered and talked about, and social media has gone crazy with it. But the mayor confirmed something that we already knew, I think, that bid specs were going to go out and be put on the street, as I say, for air conditioning and necessary repairs for the dog pound. I missed the part where the mayor explained where the money was coming from, because the dog pound trust was a big issue a couple months ago, and others were saying, no, it should come out of the budget. The money's for these repairs. Did anything develop along those lines?
I can't remember exactly. And like you said, there wasn't too much in terms of new news at this point for that agenda item, but I can't remember exactly who asked the question in terms of whether that would be paid by the Jewel Fund or whether it be paid by the general fund, a normal budget item. And the mayor did not give an answer. So I think he's holding out on that to see what he decides to later on. we'll see. That this is an issue. This is one of those issues where I'm not going to fully believe that it's getting done until it finally gets done. So here's hoping that it gets done sooner rather than later.
Let's move over to the planning and zoning meeting, which was the day before, and the Planning and Zoning Commission, I think it was a unanimous vote in a non-controversial way, passed a motion that would ban cannabis sales in Wallingford. I thought that was going to be the end of it. I mean, the mayor advocated very much for this result. He didn't want cannabis sales in Wallingford. Other people had the same reaction, but by remote, I checked in on the Democratic Town Committee meeting tonight, and apparently there is some controversial aspects to this, that some may want that issue revisited. Did you pick that up? And if so, if you were mayor of Wallingford, where would you stand on a revisiting of this issue, cannabis sales within the town?
Well, look, like you said, it's a planning and zoning decision in a lot of ways. It's a P&U decision where the mayor did make his own perspective very well known beforehand. I mean, as soon as this passed the state, I remember he had a press release, announcing his position, how he'd be fighting against having any sort of cannabis stores in Wallingford. My personal position is the opposite. I mean, regardless of how anyone feels about the state's decision to legalize, and some of the reasons to why the state decided to legalize is because all of our neighboring states did. So there's nothing really, it was leading to a whole legal nightmare, an incarceration nightmare in terms of people driving between those states, traveling through Wallingford, through Connecticut and by extension Wallingford. Like I said, coming from states where the cannabis they're in possession of was legal. Now, Wallingford's in a similar situation where, people are going to still, whether they have to go to our neighboring towns or whatever, it won't curb people using this product by not having it here. And there's no doubt that Wallingford is falling behind in terms of the revenue we're getting from businesses. So if this is an option to start filling some of those storefronts, that would be a successful business as we've seen it in neighboring states, then I'm by all means in favor of having it here as opposed to North Haven, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand you. That was a clear answer. Now back to the council meeting, there were other issues that were discussed. This episode is not to be a sort of a revisit of that council meeting because we got a ton of other things. But any other quick reactions to what was discussed at the most recent council meeting on September 14th?
Yeah, I actually think the animal shelter agenda item was probably the least eventful. And we'll not talk about it not much now because it'll be another agenda item in the near future, I'm sure. But the police department having a social media presence, that was talked about a lot. And it's one of those things that the town council and the public are overwhelmingly in favor of. The police department seems to be overwhelmingly in favor of, and the mayor is, consistent with his views on technology in that perspective. So we'll see what happens with that. And I think
before we move on from that, what did the mayor say anything clear about what his position was?
The mayor didn't say a word that whole agenda item. There were things that were addressed towards him, he was silent.
Here's my bottom line. If you don't agree, let me know. This is non-controversial. Everyone wants the police department to have a social media site. Nothing wrong with that. Doesn't cost anything. So that's that, right? I mean, that's what should happen.
Yeah, I mean, and there's huge benefits. We've seen it from other towns, both in emergencies. I mean, we just had the Farallon Drive heroics, 6 months ago, where there was a potential active shooter situation, and the police, there was a standoff for quite some time before they were able to apprehend the suspect. And at the same time, there were children playing down the road. There was no way for the police to quickly distribute information in the same way, and again, there's not a whole. It's a unifying issue. There's no need to go on it. It's clear.
This is clear. This is an easy one. We should have.
Right. The only exception to saying that it's free is the fact that obviously it takes some employee hours, but the bigger thing is training. So we've seen other towns in Connecticut whose police departments have adopted these social media presences. And when I see some of the things they post, my DOJ red flags are just going off like crazy. I mean, they're literally throwing trials out the door before they even happen in terms of guilty until proven innocent, all these other things. So there are ways to do it incorrectly. And so I'm glad that the chief was the one who actually brought this up, saying, if we're going to do this, and we're in support of it, you need to pay for training. And that much I agree. But it's pennies compared to, other things.
All right, let's move on. Any other brief reaction?
Sorry. Yeah. The biggest one was the comptroller situation.
Give me the lowdown. What happened?
Well, and then we know this has been an issue, but this is the first time that the town council really, I think, called him out for it, and members of the public did, for that matter. We all know that Jim Bowes has been gone for some time. He announced that he was leaving months before he left, and the mayor said as much at the meeting, which that was new news. That we didn't know. And so we've more or less had 6 or 7 months to know that we weren't going to have a comptroller, which I'll say it's my opinion, but I think it's also pretty objective too, the single most important position in this town. You know, he answers to the mayor, he or she answers to the mayor, but ultimately what they do is the most important work that gets done in town.
So I want to make sure I get the point. I want to make sure I understand. Is the point that the mayor was somehow negligent in not jumping on this? Is that the point of this conversation?
Well, yes, I wouldn't say it's necessarily that simple, because it's a narrative across the town that we see the positions go unfilled for so long, but this is one that can't afford to. So yeah, there hasn't been a single interview yet for the position, you know, and budget processes should be going all year. We've already had the town council had to sign a bunch of bid waivers because we didn't have a comptroller to put the bids out in the first place. I don't want to. That's fine. Yeah, we're going to go down the rabbit hole, but hopefully we'll hear more on that soon.
I'm going to give you an alternative theory. I don't know if we're all speculating here. I'm going to give you an alternative theory that maybe they tried to get a comptroller in a prompt way, in a timely way, and no one wanted it. And they couldn't get enough candidates mustered together to have a real interview. We'll never know the truth, but the mayor being negligent and slow to pull the trigger on it is one theory, but also Jim Bowes and Jim Hutt, the personnel director, may have jumped on this right away, and no one wanted to work for Wallingford. I don't know. Let's change the subject.
Sure.
Let's change the subject. So picture, if you will, this magic day after you win the election in November, and it's your first day in office, you know, in January. You walk in, not a lot of people know you. It's sort of a strange environment compared to, other environments. It very well may be that the mayor's secretary of longstanding has quit long before you came in. Joan Stave, she's been there a long, long time. And you have a desk and someone says, okay, there's your phone, there's your desk. Let's not make it a discussion of this. I assume he has a computer on his desk, but I don't even want to know. I don't want to go there. So let's not even go there. So, and here you are, kind of all by yourself. What are your first moves? And I'm not talking really the first hour of the first day, but the first few months. How do you handle the job? Where do you go? What do you do?
Sure. Well, I think the most important part of this job is surrounding yourself with, the mayor's supposed to be a generalist, right? Not specializing in anything in particular. And, most of that position and responsibility is about hiring the best people around you. Now, we're going to obviously want to hold on to as much of the institutional knowledge of the folks that are there, but some of those folks have been there almost for the mayor's entire tenure. They're not necessarily all going to want to stick around. So it's going to be a balance of bringing in new people that are qualified and experts in different parts of the departments, but also trying to combine that, more green newcomers with the people that have been there for a while. So
I want to interrupt you. I need to, and this is going to go on and on all night. I'm going to be interrupting you. Is there anyone there that you'd let go if you could? Given the civil service and job protections employees have?
No, there's not any, I can't say yes or no, I guess off the top of my head now. It's not something that I've particularly thought about in depth yet, but we are going to need a lot of new blood. Across the board. We've seen
where would the new blood be placed? What department?
Well, I think it needs to be spread out across all the departments. And look, some of the departments are 2 people, 3 people, so that's a different kind of ball game. But in general, we have look at the average age of our town hall employees or our department employees. Some of them are, a lot of them could retire any day they want to, and so it's going to be about having a more balanced kind of group, so we don't have to worry about 50% of the staff retiring in 1 year.
So I'm hearing what you say, but I'm also wondering if this is a hint at a hiring binge.
It will be the most people we've hired probably in 38 years. And part of that's going to be because I think we do need new blood in there, but a large part of it's going to be, like I said, some of these folks have been with the mayor for 38 years, and they might choose. I hope to convince many of them to stay on, but they might choose, as opposed to kind of trying to reinvent the wheel with me to hire.
I need to pin you down. So there's going to be attrition, of course. There's going to be attrition, but I'm also hearing there's additions to staff. Payroll will go up, personnel costs will go up. True?
I would disagree with that.
Okay, tell me.
If anything, there will be some positions. I'm not talking about laying anybody off, but there will likely be positions where when people retire, with the kind of technology upgrades that we're talking about, we don't necessarily have to refill those positions. Now, it won't be as obvious because we have plenty of empty positions that have been unfilled for many years at this point. So it's almost a moot point, but still.
So we kind of covered that to the depth that we're able to in this, limited amount of time. But staying on your first few months in office, and I'd like to go back to my scenario. You walk in the offices and there's a telephone. So you pick up the phone. Just work with me on this example, okay? Don't take it too literally here. But you pick up the phone, and who do you call first?
Oh, that's a real specific one. Probably whoever. Well, once they decide who will be the chairman for this upcoming town council, probably the town council chairman. One of my goals is to have a lot more transparency between, treating the town council as an actual branch of government in town, which I personally wouldn't consider it's been for some time.
So you extend an olive branch. Is that the short form way of saying you're describing your conversation with the council?
Hey, well, maybe it'll be Vinny Testa who'll be the chairman. Who knows? But it doesn't matter. Either way, trying to make it more of a group effort between the town council and the mayor than it's been in a long time. Gotcha. Because my top priority, which I assume is the first thing I want to do, which I assume is where you're going with this, is develop a long-term plan, hopefully within this first 4 to 6 months, of where we want to be at the end of 2 years, where we want to be at the end of 5 years, where we want to be at the end of 10 years. And I think we can't do that without having the town council play a major role in that.
Got it. So again, what I'm hearing, I'm going to kind of reinterpret what you say, and if I reinterpret it wrong, then you got to let me know. Sort of develop a rapport and develop sort of a teamwork kind of relationship, whether it's Vinny Cervoni or Vinny Testa or something.
I'll just say Vinny. Keeps it easy. Yeah.
All right. So, but let's say the next phone call is to the police chief. What do you tell him? What's that conversation like?
Well, look, many of the department heads already know who I am. Obviously, like I said, I've always been from Wallingford, and I've, granted, we've had a lot of department heads, jump ship or go wherever in the past year. So there's a lot of turnover in that regard. But it's to have that kind of line of communication open, more so than it's been in the past. Now, look, I'm not going to be telling, Chief Ventura what to do from day one, and nor really most of the time. I'm there to rely on these department heads as their expertise and do what I can as the head administrator of the town to make sure that they have what they need and have the cooperation from the other departments that they need.
So your next call, and I'm making this list up for you, obviously, is...
Should I be writing this down so I don't have to think about it when I get in office? I just have my list right there.
Make notes, okay? Make notes. Maybe the next one is a superintendent of schools, because your Board of Ed budget is being formed, in December and January, and it really hits high gear in February. So what's the conversation like with the superintendent of schools?
Well, one of the things we're going to have to, a lot of these budget conversations, which obviously really affect the superintendent and the Board of Ed, because that's 2/3 of our budget right there, are going to be especially complicated this year. One, for what I just said before, we still don't have a comptroller, so we're going to be behind. No matter, even if we hired one today, we'd be behind. And on top of that, we have to deal with the fact, or at least consider the fact, that we have money coming to the Board of Ed directly from ARPA, from the federal government. We have money coming directly to the town council, which is being dispersed potentially amongst departments as well. We got to make sure that we're not just cutting the Board of Ed by $4.5 million because they received it from the COVID.
Okay, so again, I need to boil this down so we don't get
sure.
So after the conversation with the superintendent of schools would be relieved and encouraged, or a little fearful that you might tighten up more than
that. I'll point out right now that, or say outright that funding to the Board of Ed will increase from what it's been, or at least at the very least, the cuts won't keep happening. The cuts won't happen to the extent that they've been happening. I mean, we've seen, conservative budgets proposed by Dr. Menza when he was still here, and then those were still cut by another 2% on many years. So that won't continue to happen because Our schools are in decline. We can talk about all these things all day. We won't now,
Yeah,
but our
no, I get
schools
enough of a
are in
flavor.
decline, and they need more funding to get back to where they once were.
Okay, so next you pick up the phone and you call in the comptroller, whose office is kind of right down the hall from you. We don't know.
Hopefully, we have a comptroller at this point.
Yeah, no, we don't know who it's going to be, but there will be one. Give me a flavor, like these other positions we've been talking about. What's the flavor of your conversation with the comptroller?
Well, the comptroller's most interesting one, right? Because under their purview would presumably be, if we wanted to go the direction, which I support, of a grant writer. If we wanted to go the direction of someone more specifically, maybe even full-time as opposed to contracted or something, to deal with the investments of the town for all the variety of the general, not just the general fund, but for a variety of other funds we use and manage that we do mostly through contracting now. So that's a longer conversation, but it's probably the most important one, because I do, have pretty significant differences in my ideas of how the town funds should be invested and how budgeting should be starting. Frankly, the day after the previous budget passes, the work on the new budget should be starting, and the town council should be playing a bigger role in that. And that's probably where we'll cut it off at that for day one, so I don't scare the new comptroller away.
Yeah, you don't want to scare him away. If he quits, you really got a problem. But this is a good segue for the next general topic I want to talk about, which is budgets, mill rates, and taxes that we have spent a little bit of time with before this production of the show. And so maybe the question that's on people's mind more than anything else is, how would the Riley O'Connell budget be different from Mayor Dickinson's budget? How would we tell the difference?
Sure. Well, we can start with certainly, at least for these first 2 years, because I know we can handle it, but presumably and hopefully for the duration of how, if I choose to run for election, however long I'm there, there won't be an increase in the mill rate. There'll be a complete freeze in the mill rate, which is better than we can say is on average been the case for the past 15 or 16 years. And part of that's because that's certainly within our spending ability to do. Now, even though there's a lot of renovations that the town needs to do, there's a lot of improvements that I would like to do. The bottom line is we're not going to spend above what we can reasonably do and still hold that mill rate steady.
Well, if you hold the mill rate steady, costs go up. I mean, if anything else, the labor costs go up. I mean, there's labor contracts being negotiated all the time, and what's baked in, I'm going to estimate that, 2 or 2.5% general wage increase, so on and so forth. The Board of Ed we've already talked about. So costs go up, and promising to freeze the mill rate sounds like, if you hold to that, sounds like you're going to run an operating deficit and take it out of the general fund. Some call it the rainy day fund. Is that true?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, look, there is a portion of the general fund that is inflated, right? Part of that should be spent on, capital expenditures and improvements and projects that ultimately pay for themselves, especially these technology projects. Most of them will pay for themselves in the first year, right? So we really want to focus on the things that have the shortest return on investment first. And they'll still be gradual, and they'll still be bonded and everything else, but that's what we want to focus on first. Now, look, and that's for the reasons exactly described.
I got to stop you. You're
sure,
losing me, and I don't want to. Most of the budget is personnel costs. Most
right.
of the budget is labor. I mean, sure, every department has things they buy, and then there's long-term capital projects, but most everything is personnel. So how do you not run a deficit? And how do you not run a deficit and you're freezing the mill rate?
Well, because generally, if you look at many of these years, certainly not all, but many, what we're still having a surplus at a lot of these years that then gets put back into the budget. So essentially the general fund will increase at the same year that the tax rate will go up or the mill rate will go up, right? So by definition, when that happens, and again, it's not every year, but when that happens, that's an example of overtaxing. We're taking more money from people, but not spending it. Part of it will be using what we call now that surplus, and by more accurately, estimating expenditures and everything else. But a bigger part, like you said, personnel is our biggest expenditure, and the Board of Ed personnel we're not going to touch. If anything, that will, well, I won't say it will go up because we're currently losing number of students, but that's That's where it is. I'm not going to touch that much at all. But look what we've seen with the state of Connecticut these past couple of years. Connecticut had an extremely large percentage of its workforce, I'm talking about the state workforce, ready for retirement over the past 2 years. And so what the current state administration has been doing, the governor and his office have been doing, is they've been using technology and renovations and improvements to basically replace these workforces when they leave, as opposed to having to lay anybody off. And hopefully by making these investments in technology, we can slowly and gradually move in that direction without ever having to, and certainly without ever having to lay people off. Does that, over time, you slowly chip away at those personnel costs?
Your first year budget, you haven't bought new technology yet. I mean, maybe there's some computers that you can, maybe there's some money left over in the old budget and you can buy some laptops or desktops or something like that. But I'm still uncertain as to how you pull this off. You're not raising the mill rate. Personnel costs go up. That means your revenues are not what they would be under Mayor Dickinson. That's the point of your plank. But
well,
you're not going to run a deficit. Everything is going to break even, and
they're going to be, the revenues are going to be calculated differently. I mean, the reality is that most years the mayor's office has overestimated expenditures and underestimated revenues. That's what that surplus is. It's more or less artificially created, right? So that you have money to go back in the general fund, because that's something that the mayor cares a lot about, as opposed to spending that money, I think, in places where it needs to be spent. Now, a lot of these technology things, aren't actually going to be that costly, or a lot of it will take a lot of time. I don't want to overpromise, but there's places we can start where we're starting to receive dividends from them pretty quickly.
Have an example?
Sure. I mean, direct deposit, it even though it only affects town employees, right? That's something that currently many of our union contracts have, if they're, especially if they're weekly, have a paid 15-minute break in their work week to go pick up their checks and deposit their checks. If you carry that out, I mean, I haven't looked at every single union contract. We're talking about tens of thousands, if not more. We're paying people to not do their job, which, keep in mind, they don't want this deal. They'd much rather just be on direct deposit. And that actual software costs close to nothing. So we could save money there. I mean, again, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars. That's not going to make the world of difference, but that's an example. Online marketing, I mean, economic development through online marketing is going to be a huge part of that as well. Doesn't cost a whole lot of money, but can start building up that grand list again, start building up our business revenue, or at least starting to stop the bleeding, because it's been going downwards. It's been declining.
We're going to make sure we get into economic development in
Sure.
about five.
Keep me on time, because I can rant. So
yes, but I want to put up on the screen an image that I sent to you and our viewers know about, just so we can get some grounding. And this is a pie chart. It should be up on the screen about 321 now. And it's a pie chart of the general fund balance as of June 30, 2020, the last data that we have available from the audit. And that pie chart shows that the total is 28,574,000, but only 16,000 and 274,000. That's the large blue section of the pie. Is the unassigned fund balance that is not committed or assigned to one use or the other. And folks like to talk about that as supporting the bond rating, and that sure, you could eat into that, $1 million or two, or maybe $1 million or 2 or 3 on an isolated year. But after a while, the conventional thinking is that hurts your bond rating. And so if you run a deficit, too often, that part of the pie shrinks. The bond people come to you when it's time to float new bonds and say, here's the bad news. You're now junk bonds. I'm overstating it. Rhetorical tool, please. And before you comment on that, I want to put up another chart, and it just shows the history, and it should be up on the screen about 321 now. And it shows the history from 2004 of our surpluses and deficits, and what years we have run surpluses and what years we have run deficits. And on the column on the right, since 2012, that vertical column, Well, you can see we've run deficits in 2017, 18, and 19. We had a surplus in 2020, really thanks to the Board of Ed. Um, and if all of those surpluses were used up for the O'Connell program, the O'Connell budgets, that would take out, and I ran a tape earlier, that would take out about 8 million from my pie chart, in 2022. So
Well,
go ahead. And
I was just going to say, I mean, you also,
tell me
sure,
what you think about what
sure.
I
I mean, you also have to keep in mind, you also have to take out from that, in theory, that what's going in, you have to subtract those deficit years. And keep in mind this, at least the graph I'm looking at, or the table, I should say, only goes back to 2004,
yeah.
when, we'd have to go back another 20 years to get this full tenure, believe it or not.
Sure.
So that's not how I want people to envision it, because the table's not going to look the same. What the table is going to show, ideally, and it might take a year to work this out, depending on who the new comptroller is and everything else. And look, the budget will be set already for the first year while I'm there. We have to deal with that as well. So we're kind of only operating in the second year in terms of adding more expenses. The idea is to be estimating that budget much closer. You're getting your surplus or deficit much closer to zero every year. These are pretty high miscalculations one way or the other most years. And sure, I mean, last year was a bit of an anomaly, sure. But we have seen that across the board where the revenues are usually purposely miscalculated. And again, it's better to have a surplus than a deficit. That's 100% true most of the time. But you want to get that number closer to zero. And by doing that, what you're really doing is you're having that money to actually spend elsewhere anyway. So ultimately, yes, it's the same effect as opposed to putting the surplus. The only reason we do it, I think, and sure, I'll preface it, this is speculation, but I believe that the reason it's done currently is because given the town council's historic lack of interest in the surplus once it comes in, the mayor more or less has complete autonomy to just do whatever he wants with that money, which is go back into the general fund. So the surplus is a little more flexible in terms of what the mayor can do with it than it is getting money from the general fund more directly.
I'm going to put that pie chart back up on the screen while I ask you this question. You're mayor for 2 years. At the end of the second year, do you want that blue section, the unassigned fund balance, to go up, down, or stay about the same? Obviously, it's not a perfect science. It's got to vary a little bit. But
well, the circle will get a little smaller, but not necessarily the blue percentage. I mean, you got to keep in mind there's things that are currently allocated for projects that are never getting it done under the current mayor. I mean, I think there's 1.4 or 1.5. There's at least $1 million allocated, for instance, to community pool. I mean, that's a project that's not going to be done anytime soon at the current rate. So there are parts of that pie chart, not just in the blue, that we can pull from. But yes, the reality is that general fund is inflated to some extent. And so we will need to rely on it in a ways, but we're not going to, I heard an accusation, we're not going to raid the rainy day fund, quote unquote, right? I mean, that's not what we're not going to spend outside of our reasonable limits.
So I'm trying to reinterpret it as I do. We've been on the air for 15 minutes. I'm trying to reinterpret and put it in my own words, but without forcing words, into your mouth. So we have an unassigned fund balance of 16 million too. In your term, look for that to shrink to some degree, 1, 2, 3 million in that range. Is that a fair summary of your position?
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to see where we are. I mean, we're still in a pandemic right now. We'll have to see where we are after my first year there, because again, I'm not really setting that budget that much. I mean, that will be mostly figured out before I take office, hopefully. Although, historically not necessarily true, but that's how it's supposed to work.
You will have budgets under your belt. At the end of the second budget, that unassigned fund balance is going to go down.
It will go down a little bit, yes.
Okay.
And I think that estimate of $1 million would probably be the best. But again, we have to see what projects we have lined up.
All right. You mentioned that the mayor overestimates expenses, underestimates revenues. That's in your materials, and we've been talking about that issue for a long time on the Citizen Lake Show. I want to get some specific numbers. An example of overestimating expenses is the police department. last year there was a $1.1 million surplus in the police department budget. I think I confronted one of the counselors during budget season about that. And this is an ongoing problem. Money left over in the police department budget. But you're not going to be subjecting yourself to a defund the police charge. Yet this is an example of what you're talking about. Public Works always has a lot of money left over. You get Rob Beltramitis in front of the council and you say, Rob, you've had a lot of money, left over. And they squeal, they whine, and all due respect to Rob, I'm overstating this as a rhetorical tool again. You can't do it. We can't, fulfill our mission. Don't take a dime away. Yet money is left over year after year after year. And another example, I mean, there's others, but is the pension fund. This past year, $675,000 was left over in the pension accounts, not the pension fund,
right.
But the yearly budget line item, $675,000 was not used. Are you saying that under the Riley O'Connell administration, this overfunding, those three examples would change? Police overfunding would go down, public works funding go down, and the pension funding go down?
Well, that's going to start with having more of a communication with the department heads. I mean, part of the reason that happens is because, and again, this is coming from previous department heads, many of whom I've like I said, I've spoken to just about all of them at this point, who said that generally they have one meeting a year with the mayor where they talk about the budget, and that's it. So they're really trying to plan for an entire year. I mean, look, especially the departments you just mentioned, police department, public works, they don't know what they're going to get every year. I mean, so no, it's, yes, we're going to try to curb that in some way in terms of having this money. But the problem is the way that it's been allocated previously makes it so even when public works has a surplus, they can't access it for things they really need. I mean, they've had to fight. We've seen them have to fight for salt, it should really be a non-negotiable. It's like asking the fire department to have to negotiate for water, right? For their fire hoses. I mean, it's a bit, I think in that point, kind of ridiculous that we're requiring. And look, I understand there's procedures that we followed. I totally get that, but it shouldn't be so much of a fight to get absolute necessities, new plow, salt for the roads. So I'm just saying this to counteract a little bit what you're saying. I know I'm being a little bit of a pain here.
You're giving a good answer, but I'm going to come back with one, which is the trick question of the night. So in view of the police department funding history, will the police department budget funding actually go down in view of all the leftover money they've had? Will it stay flat or will it go up?
In terms of what their current budget is?
The yearly annual allocation in your budget if you're elected.
And again, this is a bit of a cop out, but likely, yes, that we don't want to, we're doing something wrong if they're having a surplus of over $1 million a year, right? Or even anywhere close to $1 million a year. Part of that though, is because like many departments, they're having trouble filling staff positions that they budgeted for.
Yeah.
So again, that's why I say, fortunately, I more or less have a year to build a rapport with these department heads to see where they really need money for what projects, et cetera. But that's really where that communication comes in.
All right. I think you've done as well with this issue as you can possibly do. So let me change the subject on you and talk about, again, the gift that keeps on giving for the Citizen Mike Show is the controversy between one high school or two high schools. I think that my editorial comment is, I think that the Board of Ed has put 10-foot pole marks all over this issue, and they're not terribly interested in moving us forward or talking about it or being specific about the progress they need to make. So I expect that if you're elected and you come back for re-election and you're on the Citizen Mike Show in 2023 in September, we're going to be in the exact same position. Unless the mayor, maybe tries to move the needle a little bit, at least to come to a decision, because in the absence of a decision, the schools could further deteriorate because no one wants to invest in the schools if they're going to be, rebuilt, but yet no one wants to take the political heat for a decision that's unpopular. While you think about that, I want to read you something, and I'm going to ask if you agree or disagree. Ready? Schools. It would seem to make sense to consolidate the high schools and renovate one building that would be safe, efficient, and useful for all of the students in town. I worry that the concern with keeping two high schools comes down to vanity concerns like the football rivalry or Powder Puff, but plenty of other towns have one high school and make it work. Again, It would be a shift from an old way to a new way. We would adjust. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, first of all, I love that you couldn't get the Board of Ed members to answer this question, which is their job to answer. And so you're putting it on my plate instead. So I appreciate that. Look, I mean, you hit the nail on the head right off the bat with the, are we still going to be languishing in not having made a decision by 2023? And that's the real problem. I'm going to defer, quite a bit to the Board of Ed here. But the reality is whichever decision is made, and I had serious concerns about the one high school plan from the start. Now I can see arguments for either or. But the reality is what we can't keep doing is kicking the can down the road every single election year. Because what happens is this is the process we've seen for years now. The Board of Ed gets elected. They spend 100.
I got to stop
you. Okay.
The Board of Ed is not taking the bull by the horns. I mean, we know what they should do, what they might do, what they could do. But this has been languishing, and past record is an indication of a future behavior. That's
basic you're right.
Stuff, basic stuff.
But we can't we can't
you as mayor, you have a bully pulpit. You have powers of persuasion and other authorities. What do you do specifically to get to move the needle?
Well, I use that bully pulpit to say, look, I'm going to defer to the Board of Ed because I've spent dozens of hours, probably over 100 hours invested into learning as much about this one school proposal versus two as possible. But I'm not a Board of Ed member. I mean, they'll always have insight to the situation that I won't. But what I cannot, and no mayor can allow them to do, and this is where the mayor does come in and play a role, is just keep kicking the can down the road. They were elected to this job, and now there's a conversation that I think is ultimately going to happen if a new mayor doesn't step in. That I think is the only way that this process breaks that you're talking about is if they want to put it to referendum. And for exactly the statement you read, I don't think that makes any sense. Not only is it the nostalgia that can kind of cloud our judgment here, but it's also, I've heard consistent arguments. I mean, again, I'm a huge sports fan, a huge Wallingford sports fan. My whole family is. But the argument that, we should combine the schools because then our sports team, when we combine Sheen and Lyman Hall, will be so good with one of the trophies. One, completely misses the point of what high school sports is about. And two, we are going to get smacked those first couple of years in sports school being a different division. I mean, it's a ridiculous argument to make.
I want to bring this to a head because there's a lot of other things I want to talk about.
Sure.
Do you agree with the quote or not? It would seem to make sense to consolidate. We would shift to a new way. We would adjust. It seems to be leaning towards one high school. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I wouldn't say I'm leaning towards one high school, but yeah, I agree with the sentiment. I could totally justify one high school. But what I can't justify is how out of the first 4 days of Lyman Hall's full-time school year, they had 2 half days because they didn't have air conditioning in the building because the building's so old. So they had 2 half days for heat. And then they had the whole first Thursday off because the building flooded. It's one of the oldest school buildings in the state, and it was built on a swamp. I mean, what cannot be acceptable, and it has somehow languished for as long as you're talking about, is just having these falling, truly physically crumbling schools.
Well,
as our Board of Ed.
Let me end this segment with a disclosure and an editorial comment. This is a conversation. I get to participate too. I get to, and the Citizen Mike Show is an opinion show, and I get to, my opinion, doesn't count. But this quote was from Alexa Tomasi's website. How about that?
Well, I imagine that. Sure.
Yeah. And I agree with what she said, and maybe even a little stronger, that it would be in Wallingford's long-term best interests to have one high school that was cutting edge, knock your socks off, kind of a building, a building that real estate agents would drive prospective buyers around and through to say, and this is the best high school in the state. Not cutting corners. I don't care what the tax hawks say. If you're going to do it, you do it first class, and it becomes a showpiece. It has quality of life implications. It has educational implications, not only for equity, all the way across town. Students have the exact same opportunity. It has economic development implications because people want to come here
absolutely
because of the school, and that draws executives and their families. So my personal view, the Citizen Mike Show view, is I'm in favor of one high school if done really, really, really well.
It's got to be done right. And if I can just have one last word, I apologize.
Yeah,
I want to
sure.
extend this further, but this is an important part of my entire campaign and why I decided to run in the first place. Wallingford is in a really dangerous trend right now. The most recent census data came out from 2010 to 2020. Our child demographic, so they define it as 25 and under, which I take a little bit of issue with, but has decreased by 15%. 15. I mean, that is, we've seen this happen in towns across the country. We've seen it happen in countries across the world. That is a death spiral if you can't at least slow down that trend for any town. Families form the base of our tax base, the pillars of our community. And the only last thing I'll say about it is that's why the first people I talked to were realtors and real estate agents, because they know why people are moving and moving in, moving out and moving in. And the number one reason why Wallingford has had this population decline in young families is because our schools went from 40 years ago when we were top 5 school district in the state to today where we're not even hitting state averages. So, and that's the problem.
When I read that quote and I disclosed to you that was from Alexa Tomasi's website, the little beeper went off in my ear and said, "You never said who Alexa Tomasi was." She's a Democratic candidate for the Wallingford Town Council. Some people may not know that, so that's why I'm putting that in. Ready to change the subject?
Sounds good.
All right, sounds good. So we're going to begin to run out of time, so I gotta triage this a little bit.
You'll have to bring me back next time, I guess.
Yeah, maybe so, or break this into 2 episodes. But this next topic would help us understand how you would approach a problem that may come up in the future. The mayor of a town, the mayor of a city, has law enforcement, the safety of the streets as one of his portfolios. And recently there was some reporting in the Record Journal about problems at Doolittle Park. I guess there were kids bullying kids. The specifics of the incident I don't really want to get into because it could reoccur in another setting with other people. But it seemed to be that the tug of war was law enforcement, more law enforcement, surveillance cameras versus more programming. And there was a bright line. So let's say this happens again, not necessarily Doolittle, but some other place, but on town property, on public property, and people are clamoring for action. You know how that works, the populist movement. Your mayor, how do you address this? On the program side, give the kids more things to do so that they don't get into bad behavior, or from the law enforcement side, we're going to get surveillance, we're going to find out who they are, and we're going to knock on their door. Your thoughts?
Well, I think, and I agree that people have tried to make it black and white in that regard, but the reality is both of those work hand in hand. I mean, we had the police chief saying exactly that. I mean, they work directly with social services. They work with these other programs. One of the reasons for having these surveillance cameras is that we can follow up with kids that are either maybe doing something dangerous for themselves, whether it's drug related or whatever. And when the police know who they are, they can then follow up with them by the proper programs and procedures. So
surveillance cameras are okay with you?
I mean, we're talking about a public space, right? Yes. We're not talking, right? Space. No, that's what I'm saying. In the Doolittle, absolutely, for the Doolittle situation.
Okay.
I mean, it's the reality is the big issue that I've seen is, look, if Chief Ventura says we need more officers, which he has not said, nor did Chief Wright, we can have that conversation. But more or less, since in my lifetime, the issue hasn't been not having enough officers. It's been not having basic technology and resources to do their job in the modern era.
So I got half of it down. I got that surveillance is okay with you, given the appropriate circumstances, severity of the problem, and all that.
Right.
The other half
for a completely public location like the Doolittle scenario, yes.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
A public location. The other half of the equation is, do you spend more money on programming? Do you look at your park and recs and say, you need to offer more programs for these 10, 11, 12-year-old bullies that are intimidating and terrorizing the younger kids? Do you spend more money on programming?
Sure. And for most of these, well, in general, for most of these programming options, a lot of this funding doesn't even come from the town. It comes from nonprofits. It comes from the state. It comes from the federal government even. So there are ways in which we can, I mean, look, we have Rosa DeLauro, Congresswoman DeLauro, as head of appropriations for the federal government that covers our area. And we also have Mary Majinski, who covers our area as well, who's also the longest serving rep in the state house. So we have more access to state and federal funds than just about any other town in the country. We haven't taken advantage of it. So there are ways to improve these programs without directly pulling from the general fund significant amounts of money.
Well, the day may come where we do. It's choice. If you don't have the money in the general fund, then you don't do the programming. So I find your answer kind of a maybe, a strong maybe, if depending if there's grant money. I think we're going to leave it there because we got to move on. There's a couple things that positions you have taken in the past. It's on your website. I wanted to run it by you and see if we can get some more clarity on it. This has to do with the rainy day fund. And it said, in the context of this past year, what you wrote on your website, in the context of this past year under a pandemic, rather than pull from the rainy day fund that has not been touched in over 40 years, we merely stood by as countless businesses closed their doors for good in what could be considered the rainiest of years. I read that and I said, well, first of all, he's going to revise his website because we have taken from the rainy day fund. So I expect that revision pretty quick. So we have taken money. Anytime we run a deficit, we're taking from the rainy day fund. Right. But were you suggesting there that money from the rainy day fund should be distributed to businesses in distress?
Well, not necessarily distributed to business in distress, like we're talking about with this ARPA money, but more so used on group resources that multiple businesses can use. So if you look at the businesses right in the center of town, right, where when restaurants weren't allowed to have guests or customers indoors, the town could have done a better job of promoting outdoor seating and paying for outdoor seating communal, right? As opposed to, I mean, look at, we had other restaurants and breweries, for instance, that tried to go on their own way by hiring and coordinating with food trucks. And they never received any assistance from the town. The only time they heard from the town over the course of the pandemic was as soon as they put these food trucks in, they got a call from town hall saying that's not you can't do that according to planning and zoning and everything else. So we're going to shut you down tomorrow if you don't get rid of the food truck. I mean, we're basically actively working against our own businesses in a time of real economic and in all sense of the word distress. So look, this past year has been an exception. And there will be other exceptions down the road, don't be wrong. But there are times when it certainly is in the long-term economic as well as communal and community-based interest of the town to whatever we can in times of crisis to keep businesses afloat if they have a reason to be afloat and it's only a temporary issue.
Let me read you another position that you took. Again, it comes from your website. And you wrote this: with an open line of communication, the town can stay attuned to what companies need to be, let me start again. With an open line of communication, the town can stay attuned to which companies need to be given incentives to stay and which companies are truly struggling so we can offer support. I read that and it sounds like incentives mean tax breaks. You give a tax break to a business and the rest of the public has to make up with a tax break. It hurts it just seems like a redistribution there. And which companies are truly struggling so we can offer support. It sounds like you're willing to cut a check.
No, so, and I can appreciate why it sounds like that. And first of all, I'm glad you actually read my website because you won't find too much in terms of platform on my opponent's website, but that's neither here nor there. What I'm talking about is basically what we just mentioned: communal ways in which you can use money to maybe improve the sidewalks, improve the lighting in the center of town, ways that you can improve the town itself that increases the revenue of those businesses indirectly. I don't think, and this is my own personal, but it's an important political ideology. I think whenever you're picking winners and losers, just be, cutting checks to businesses, that's when you're going to run into some real issues. Now, when I'm saying that open line of communication, so we don't have that same incidence where we had this issue with planning and zoning and everything right in the middle of a pandemic when these businesses need with every bit of help they can get. I mean, the police department knew to relax, for instance, a lot of open container laws outside of these restaurants that didn't necessarily have their licenses because they knew that people needed to be flexible to get us past this troubling situation. So hopefully that kind of clarifies it. And in terms of the incentives, more what I'm talking about there is, and that you'll see this on that same page on my website, I'm sure. I'm really talking about actively seeking out industries and businesses that have proven to do well in Connecticut but also,
I got to cut you off.
okay, then I don't want to, sure.
And we're kind of wandering off the topic. So I just want to bottom line what I'm hearing from you. If I'm not hearing it right, let me know. On that which I just read, incentives and support, you're not talking about tax breaks, and you're not talking about cash subsidies. You're talking about other things. Is that true?
That is 100% true. Now, the ARPA money is a bit different, but yes.
Yeah. Citizen Mike Show is going to develop a whole episode to the
Great.
ARPA, to the ARPA money. And,
you might need 3 to cover that.
Yeah, we might have 3. And I'm thinking that Steve Knight and I will go at it because I think that's what the programming has in store sometime in October. You've got 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Why should people vote for you?
I'll try to make it an analogy because I think that's the only way I can compete with my opponent, I think. I like to describe Wallingford kind of as being a bus, and we're all the residents of Wallingford were sitting on that bus, and it's very comfortable seats. It's got nice air conditioning, beautiful views out the window. And what I'm asking the town to give me the privilege of is to take that wheel, because the bus is currently heading straight for a cliff, one that's so steep that once we go over it, and it's gradual. It's been a gradual downhill that's barely noticeable for quite some time. But once we go over it, we're not coming back from it. That's an irreversible step. And all I'm trying to do is gradually, ever so slightly, turn that wheel so that we avoid that cliff without, if you're on the bus and not looking out the front window, everything's going to feel more or less the same. We're going to slowly be avoiding disaster and then ultimately trying to go back uphill and improving the town in a variety of ways. But that's the best way I can describe it, because Wallingford's afraid of change. Wallingford voters are afraid of change, and I get that. It's not going to be turning town upside down, but we do need to start being proactive as a town, as opposed to reactive. Otherwise, I have really serious concerns about what the future of this town holds. That's why I'm hoping folks will give me their support.
Let's make that the final word. Thanks for coming on the Citizen Mike Show. Good luck on the campaign trail.
Thank you for having me, Mike. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for tuning in. And thanks again, Riley O'Connell, and good luck. Good night, everybody.